The cart moved before sunrise. Sarah did not look back at the village. She had made that decision the night before, lying on her thin mat, with her eyes open and her hands folded on her stomach, listening to the sound of the elders arguing in the room next door, about which one of them would have to tell her. She had saved them the trouble. When old Elder Bram finally pushed open her door at midnight, candle in hand, the words already shaped in his mouth like stones he did not want to carry, he found her sitting up, bag packed, boots on, notebook in her lap. She looked at him with eyes that held no surprise and no accusation, only the flat, steady patience of someone who had been waiting for this particular thing for a very long time. He said her name. She said nothing, because she never said anything. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked past him into the hallway. He blew out the candle and stood in the dark for a moment. She was already at the door. The cart belonged to the Transport Guild, which was a dignified name for 4 men with a wagon, and a legal obligation to deliver the tribute to Varnhold by the 3rd dawn of the month of frost. They were not cruel men, they were also not kind ones. They were practical men who had learned not to think too carefully about what they were carrying, the way a river does not think carefully about what it moves downstream. The driver was called Owen. He had a red beard and a scar on his left hand from a carving accident 12 years ago, and he talked to his horse the way other men talked to their wives. When Sarah climbed into the back of the cart without being told, and sat down against the sideboards and opened her notebook, Owen glanced at her once in the mirror of his peripheral vision, looked away, and clicked his tongue at the horse. The other 3 men sat up front. None of them spoke to her. The road out of Ashvale was unpaved, and the cart wheels found every hole in it. Sarah braced her feet against the opposite board and wrote. She wrote the way other people breathed, automatically and without stopping to consider it. The notebook was her 3rd this year. The previous 2 were stacked under a loose floorboard in the room she had just left, in a house that would belong to someone else by the end of the week. She did not write about where she was going. She wrote about the sky, which was the particular dark blue of the hour before sunrise, and how it sat against the tree line like a held breath. She wrote about the sound the wheels made on the frozen road, half creak and half groan, as if the cart itself was reluctant. She wrote about Owen's horse, which was an old gray animal named, according to the letters burned into the side of the feed bucket strapped to the cart's rear, Marta. She found this interesting. She noted it. The village of Ashvale disappeared behind the first curve of the road. She did not look back. The tribute system was not new. It was not secret. It was the kind of thing that had existed long enough to have its own official documents, its own legal language, its own ceremony of selection, and its own unspoken rule that no one in the villages talked about it too loudly or too long. Every 5 years, each tributary pack submitted 1 person to Varnhold. The king received the tribute. What happened after that depended on who the king was, and Calder, who had ruled for 11 years now, had his own way of doing things. The official language called it an honor. The villages called it other things when the elders thought the younger ones could not hear. Sarah had heard plenty. She was 22 years old. She had been born mute, or had become mute, depending on who in the village you asked, and most of them gave answers that said more about themselves than about her. She had stopped correcting people about it years ago. The correction required words she did not use, and the result was never worth the trouble. What she knew was this. She had not spoken since she was 7 years old. She did not remember the last thing she had said. She was not sad about this in the way people expected her to be, the way they searched her face for sorrow whenever the topic came up, the way they tilted their heads with expressions of practiced sympathy. She had built a life inside silence, the way other people build houses, carefully and over time, with rooms for different purposes. The notebook was one of those rooms. She had filled 2,014 pages since she was 9 years old. She had counted. The cart rolled on. By the time the sun came fully up, they were out of pack territory and into the open road that ran between Ashvale and the capital, a straight gray line that cut through pine forest and frozen fields, and occasional clusters of bare-branched trees that looked, in the flat winter light, like old men standing with their arms spread. Sarah watched the landscape with the concentrated attention she gave to everything, because everything was worth writing down, and nothing came back once it was gone. Owen stopped the cart at mid-morning to let Marta drink from a roadside stream. The 3 men climbed down and ate bread from their packs, standing in a loose cluster and talking in low voices about things that had nothing to do with her. She did not mind this. She ate the food she had packed herself, 2 boiled eggs, and a square of hard cheese, and a piece of fruit that had been sitting in the village storehouse since autumn and was just beginning to go soft, and she drank from the small flask she kept in her coat pocket. One of the men, the youngest of the 3, who had sandy hair and the look of someone who had taken this job because it was the only one available, caught her eye while she was eating. He looked like he wanted to say something. She had seen this look many times in her life. It was the look of someone who felt that her silence was a problem they should try to fix, who felt that the right combination of kind words would unlock something in her that had just been waiting for the right key. She looked back at him with an expression that said, very clearly, that she appreciated the thought and that he did not need to bother. He looked away. She finished her fruit. The cart moved again after half an hour and did not stop until mid-afternoon, when they reached the small way station at the edge of Varnhold territory. The way station was a stone building with 3 rooms and a stable, staffed by 2 of the king's border officers who checked the paperwork and logged the arrival and offered them the use of the rooms for the night. The transport men took 2 rooms. Owen pointed Sarah toward the 3rd without making eye contact. The room had a narrow bed and a window that looked north. She could see, in the far distance, where the sky met the darker shape of Varnhold city, the faint outline of towers. She stood at the window for a long time. The towers did not move. The city did not change shape. She stood there until the light was gone, and the towers were just a darkness against the darker sky. And then she sat on the bed and opened her notebook and wrote for 2 hours before she lay down and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. She thought about the elder's face when he had come to her room. She thought about the way the other villagers had looked at her from their doorways that morning as the cart left, the way not one of them had stepped forward, and the way she had understood this fully and without bitterness, because bitterness is a fire that requires fuel, and she had learned years ago to stop feeding it. She thought about what came next. She knew what was said about Varnhold's king. Everyone knew. The stories had the texture of things repeated often enough to become furniture, part of the background of life in the tributary packs. Calder the Cold, some people called him, because he had ruled for 11 years without once showing anything that looked like warmth. Calder the Blade, others said, though that was usually whispered, and usually by people who had a reason to be careful. What she knew for certain was this: the tribute was received. The person was assessed. Sometimes they were assigned to court service. Sometimes they were sent to the border posts. Sometimes, if the king was in a particular mood and the tributes pack had fallen behind on their obligations, other things happened. She did not dwell on this. She had a notebook. She had a coat with good buttons. She had 2 extra pairs of socks that she had rolled and tucked into the corners of her bag, with the care of someone who understood that comfort in small things is the foundation of endurance in large ones. She would manage. She always had. Morning came gray and cold. The transport men ate in the way station's main room and did not invite her to sit with them, and she did not wait to be invited. She sat at the end of the table with her notebook open and ate the last of her hard cheese and listened to Owen talk about his horse's tendency to favor her left foreleg in cold weather, and how the guild kept promising to replace the old shoes and kept not doing it. The sandy-haired man, whose name she had gathered was Ned, ate his bread in 3 large bites and then stared at the table. He had the look of someone approaching a decision. "We'll be there by midday," he finally said, addressing the general table rather than her specifically. Owen nodded and said something about Marta's leg again. The 2 border officers, eating at the other end of the table, did not look up from their plates. Sarah wrote, "The sound of men eating bread is the same everywhere." She found this comforting. The last leg of the road was paved. Varnhold City announced itself gradually, the way large things often do. First a smell of smoke and horses and cooked food, then the sound of bells from the city's outer posts, then the gates themselves, which were iron and very tall, and manned by 6 guards in the king's livery, a dark gray that was almost black, with a silver crest on the left shoulder that Sarah looked at carefully as they passed through. A running wolf, stylized, with one eye looking backward. She noted this. The city was loud in the way all cities are loud, with the noise of too many people existing simultaneously in too small a space, and Sarah sat very still in the back of the cart and watched everything. She had never been to a city. Ashvale had maybe 300 people and one main street. Varnhold had thousands, with roads that crossed and split and crossed again, with market stalls and guild houses and buildings that were 4 stories tall, which she found quietly astonishing. People stopped to look at the cart. Not many, and not for long. The tribute cart had made this journey before. People knew what it carried. She kept her face still and looked back at anyone who looked at her too long. The palace was at the center of the city, separated from the surrounding streets by a wide courtyard of pale stone. It was not beautiful in the way that songs about palaces describe things. It was heavy. It was built to last, and to remind people that it would last, with walls 2 feet thick and windows that were high and narrow and let in the minimum necessary amount of light. It was the building of a man who did not trust the world to stay the way he wanted it, and had decided to build something that would make the world stay anyway. She noted this too. The cart stopped in the courtyard. Owen climbed down with the creak of a man whose back had opinions about long journeys, and one of the palace guards came forward to receive the paperwork. The other transport men stood to the side. Nobody helped Sarah down from the cart, which was fine because she did not need help. She picked up her bag. She climbed down. She stood in the center of the pale courtyard, with the cold wind coming off the upper battlements, and the guards moving around her with the efficient indifference of people doing a job they had done many times. And she took one breath, and then another, and then she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and walked where the guards directed her to walk. The great hall was tall. The ceiling was dark wood, and the floor was pale stone, and the torches along the walls made everything flicker slightly, so that the shadows of the assembled court moved like a separate crowd standing just behind the real one. There were perhaps 60 people in the room, and they all looked at her when she entered, and the looking had a particular quality she recognized from markets and village squares, and the faces of people who had come to watch something they expected to be briefly interesting before returning to their usual concerns. She walked to the center of the hall and stopped. The throne was at the far end, raised on 3 steps of gray stone. The man on it was not what the stories had built in her mind. She had expected something louder, something that announced itself the way danger usually does, with noise and movement and the energy of impending impact. Calder was very still. He was not old, perhaps 30, perhaps a little more. He had dark hair and a face that gave nothing away, not because it was blank, but because whatever was behind it had learned to stay there. He sat with the ease of someone who had sat on that throne for so long that the chair and the body had reached an agreement. He held no weapon. He wore no crown. He did not need either. His advisor, a thin man with quick eyes, stood at the bottom of the throne steps and read her name aloud from the tribute document, her village, her age, the standard formal language that turned a person into a list of facts. Calder looked at her for the first time. It was a brief look, the kind a man gives something that he is cataloging and will deal with later. His eyes were gray. They moved over her once, returned to his advisor, and he made a small gesture with his right hand, the kind of gesture that contains an entire sentence of dismissal. Lower cells, his advisor said. Until the right. The court made a sound of quiet approval, the polite murmur of people confirming that things were proceeding as expected. Sarah looked at the floor. She counted the tiles between herself and the throne. There were 47. Then she looked back up. For one moment, before the guards moved to direct her away, she looked directly at the king, not with defiance, not with fear, with the same flat, steady attention she had given the sky that morning, and the towers the night before, and every other thing that was true and present and worth understanding. He was already looking somewhere else. She let the guards lead her from the hall. She counted the turns as they walked, committing the route to memory, the way she committed everything to memory. Because memory is the only thing no one can take by decree. 2 left turns, 1 right, a staircase going down, a corridor that smelled of stone and cold and old wood, and then a door with a heavy bolt that the guard slid back without ceremony. The cell was not as bad as she had expected. Stone floor, but clean. A wooden pallet with a folded blanket. A small high window that let in a stripe of pale afternoon light. A bucket in the corner. A hook on the wall where a lantern could hang. The guard set the lantern down on the floor and left without speaking. The bolt slid back into place. She stood in the middle of the cell and looked at the four walls and the low ceiling and the stripe of light from the window. Then she set her bag down, took out her notebook, sat cross-legged on the pallet, and opened to the next clean page. She wrote for a long time. She wrote about the tiles in the Great Hall, 47 of them between herself and the throne. She wrote about the throne itself, the way it sat on its 3 steps, like something that had always been there, and intended to keep being there. She wrote about the gray walls of the palace, and the thin advisor with the quick eyes, and the sound of the court's polite murmur, which was the same sound, she noted, as approval at a village market when the scale comes up correct. Then she stopped. She looked at the stripe of light on the opposite wall. She wrote, "He did not look long enough to see anything. This is either very good or very bad, and I have not decided which." She underlined it. Then she turned the page and started a fresh one. Outside, the palace went about its business. The court dispersed. The advisor filed the paperwork. The guards changed shift at the sound of the 4th bell. In the lower corridor, the only light was the one in her cell, and through the small high window, the last of the afternoon was going out of the sky, in a streak of cold orange. She watched it go. She was still writing when the orange became gray, and the gray became black, and the stripe of light on the wall disappeared entirely, and she did not stop until the lantern oil had burned low enough to make the letters hard to read. Then she set the notebook down and lay back on the pallet with her hands folded on her stomach, the same position she had held the night before in her room in Ashvale, waiting for old Elder Bram to come tell her what she already knew. She closed her eyes. The palace breathed around her, the way old buildings do, with the sounds of settling wood and distant footsteps and wind moving through gaps in the stones. She breathed with it. Tomorrow was the rite. She already had thoughts about that. The court assembled at the 9th bell. Calder knew this because he had heard the 9th bell every morning for 11 years, the way he heard his own heartbeat, as background noise that confirmed the world was still running on schedule. He dressed without assistance, because he had dismissed the last personal attendant 3 years ago, after deciding that the performance of being dressed by another person was one of the many small indignities of royalty that he was no longer willing to perform. He did it himself. He buckled his own cuffs. He did not look in the mirror. He went down to the great hall through the back corridor, which no one used but him, because it was faster, and because the back corridor did not require him to pass the receiving rooms where the court liked to gather in clusters before official proceedings, and make the kind of conversation he found exhausting by its 3rd word. The hall was full. The rite of tribute was not, in the technical sense, a public event, but in practice, the court found reasons to attend whenever one was scheduled, because the court liked to watch things, and liked to be seen watching things, and the rite offered both at once. They arranged themselves along the sides of the hall with the orderly enthusiasm of people who had decided to enjoy themselves while maintaining the posture of official witnesses. Calder stood at the top of the throne steps and looked at them. They looked back with the expectant faces of an audience that had sat down. He descended the steps and walked to the dais. The dais was a raised circle of pale stone at the center of the hall, older than the throne, older than the hall itself if the historians were to be believed, which Calder privately was not sure they should be. It had a ceremonial ring inset into the floor, and a space where the tribute would stand. The blade for the rite sat on a stone ledge to the right, unsheathed, plain iron, not decorative. The rite did not require decoration. It required a mark on the record, and a mark on the person, and then it was done. He had done this 7 times in 11 years. He waited at the dais while the door at the far end of the hall opened. She walked in. He had noted her yesterday. Unremarkable, small, dark-haired, the expression of someone who was paying attention but choosing not to show it. He had filed this and moved on, because there were 87 other things demanding his attention by the end of the day, and the tribute was one item on a list. She walked to the center of the dais and stopped. He moved to stand in front of her, which put them perhaps 4 feet apart, and picked up the ceremonial blade from the ledge. She looked at him. Not at the blade. At him. He had done this 7 times. In those 7 times, the tribute had looked at the blade, or at the floor, or at a fixed point somewhere behind his left shoulder. People in this position looked anywhere except directly at him, because looking directly at him required a particular kind of steadiness that most people in a frightening situation could not manage. She was looking at him, the way someone looks at a problem they are actively solving. He took the half-step forward that the ceremony required. He raised the blade, and something stopped him. He did not understand what it was immediately. It was not hesitation in the way he understood hesitation, not a failure of will or a sudden change of mind. It was more physical than that. Something landed in his chest with the weight and precision of an object falling from a height, and his body's first response was the animal response, not thought but sensation, the way you flinch before you know why. He stood there with the blade raised and the court watching, and the smell of her reaching him for the first time, close now, unavoidable, and his entire body said the word no in the clearest possible terms. He did not move. The court, which had been making the polite sounds of an audience engaged in a ceremony proceeding correctly, went quiet. He lowered the blade. He turned to the assembled court. His face, he was aware, was doing something he did not have full control over, which was unusual. He got it still. He looked at his advisor, who stood at the edge of the room with the document open in his hands, and an expression of careful blankness that meant he was working very hard at being neutral. "Suspended," Calder said. His voice came out flat and level, which was its only setting. The advisor said, "My king, the right, suspended, royal prerogative, noted in the record." He set the blade back on the ledge. He walked to the throne steps without looking at anyone. Behind him, the court began to breathe again, and then to murmur, and the murmur had the texture of people trying to decide how to react to something they had not expected. He sat on the throne. His advisor was still standing near the dais, holding the document, looking at Sarah, who was still standing on the dais, looking at Calder, with the same expression she had arrived with, which was the expression of someone who had just received an interesting piece of information that they intended to think about carefully. "The tribute," the advisor said carefully, walking toward the throne, "is to be held in the lower cells, pending clarification of the kings." "East Wing," Calder said. There was a pause. "The East Wing, my king." "Third room from the stairs, it has a window." He paused. "Find out what she needs." The advisor had been Calder's advisor for 7 years. He had long ago learned that there were 2 categories of the king's decisions, the ones that could be questioned and the ones that could not. He was very good at telling them apart. "Yes, my king," he said, and walked back to the dais. Sarah watched him come. She had not moved from the center of the circle during the entire exchange. She had watched the king lower the blade and speak to his court, and walk to his throne and sit on it, with the same concentrated attention she gave everything, the same attention she had given the 47 tiles yesterday, and the torch shadows last night, and the stripe of light on the cell wall. She had also, while the king's back was turned and before the advisor reached her, torn a page from her notebook, written 1 word on it, and left it on the altar stone at the edge of the dais. The advisor did not notice it. He was looking at her face, trying to read a situation he did not fully have the information for. "You'll be moved to more comfortable quarters," he said. His name was Henry, she would learn later, and he had a wife in the merchant district, and 2 daughters whose names he kept in small carved frames on his desk. She looked at him. She nodded once. He led her out. The page on the altar stone sat where she had left it, until the court began to disperse, and then one of the junior guards picked it up to clean the dais, and read it with the puzzled expression of someone encountering a word they understand completely, but in a context that does not make sense, and set it back down. Calder did not see it until later. Later was 3 hours later, when the court had cleared, and the great hall had returned to its usual empty state, that particular quality of silence that large rooms have when they have recently contained many people, and the people have all left. He walked the hall in the late afternoon, which was a habit he had not explained to anyone, and did not intend to. He walked the hall because the hall was the center of what he had built, and what he had inherited, and sometimes walking through it reminded him of why he had done any of it, and sometimes it did not, but either way the walking was useful. He saw the paper on the dais stone from 20 feet away. He picked it up. He read the word on it. He stood there with the paper in his hand for a long time. Coward. 1 word, in very small neat handwriting, with no decoration and no question mark and no explanation. Just the word, sitting on the page like a stone somebody had placed deliberately and then walked away from. He folded the paper once and put it in his coat pocket. He resumed his walk. In the east wing, in the third room from the stairs, which had a window that faced east, and a proper bed, and a desk that was used for storing things that needed to be stored temporarily, but had been there long enough to become permanent, Sarah was unpacking her bag with the methodical care she brought to all practical tasks. She had a system: the notebook and the 2 remaining pencils on the desk, the folded change of clothes on the chair by the window, the extra socks tucked under the edge of the mattress where they would not be obvious, but would be accessible, the small personal items, the ones whose nature was private, in the bottom of the bag which she pushed under the bed. A kitchen servant had brought a tray while she was still in the cell waiting to be moved, and the tray had made the journey with her. It had bread and something hot in a clay bowl, and a cup of something that turned out to be tea. She ate without ceremony, standing by the window, looking out at the east face of the palace courtyard, where 2 junior guards were doing a shift change in the late afternoon light, and a cat was sitting on the edge of the stone wall, watching them with the profound disinterest of a creature that has concluded that human activity is not, at a fundamental level, its concern. She noted the cat. She approved of its philosophy. She finished the tea. She sat at the desk. She opened the notebook to the page after the last entry and wrote, "The right did not happen. I do not know why yet. I have a window." Then she looked at the window for a moment. She added, "The coward read the note. I could tell by the way he walked back through the hall afterward. His pace had changed by 4%. She had not actually seen him read it. She had been on her way out of the hall by then. But she had heard the quality of the silence behind her as she left, and she had made a reasonable assessment. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote a list, because she found lists clarifying. She wrote, "Things I know, things I do not know, things I need to find out." Under the first, she put, "The king has not harmed me. There is a window. The east wing has at least 3 usable staircases. The kitchen is on the ground floor, south side, based on where the tray came from. The advisor's name is Henry, based on how the junior guard addressed him. Under the second, why the right was suspended, what happens to tributes who are not processed, what the king expects from me. Under the third, the layout of the library, whether it exists, where." She had been in the palace for less than 1 day, and the library was her most pressing practical question, which she understood was not how most people in her situation would order their priorities. Most people in her situation would be thinking about safety, about food, about what came next in the large sense. She was thinking about these things too, but underneath them, and more urgently, was the specific quiet hunger for a room with many books in it. She had always been this way. By the time the evening bell rang, she had filled 4 pages and had a reasonably good mental map of the East Wing, based on the walk from the cells, and she had also made a decision about the next morning. She would find the library herself. This was not a rebellious decision. It was a practical one. She had not been given instructions to stay in the room. She had not been told she could not walk in the palace. She had been moved to better quarters, which implied a kind of status that was still undefined, but was clearly a step above prisoner. She would test the edges of that status carefully. She changed into her second set of clothes, folded the first set, and sat back at the desk to write until the light was gone. When she finally lay down and closed her eyes, the notebook was closed on the desk, and she had written 9 new pages, and she had processed, in the way she processed everything, through language, every significant event of the past 2 days. She was not afraid. She had been afraid before, in her life. She understood the feeling. This was something different. This was the sensation of standing at the edge of an unknown territory, and knowing that you have, through no particular choice of your own, just crossed the line into it, and that there is no line to cross back. This was the feeling of a story beginning. She had read enough of them to know what that felt like. In his chambers on the 3rd floor, Calder was standing by the window that looked north over the city, a glass of dark wine in his hand, untouched. He had been standing there for 20 minutes. He was thinking about the ceremony and the blade and the moment his body had said no, before his mind had fully caught up to the reason. He was thinking about the paper in his coat pocket. He was thinking about the word on the paper. He took 1 drink of the wine. He set the glass down. He sat at his own desk, which was large and covered with the papers of governance, the endless documents that running a kingdom produced in the way rivers produce silt, constantly and without concern for whether anyone wanted it. He picked up the first document and read it. He picked up the second. He read 3/4 of it before his mind drifted. He put the paper down. He thought about the way she had looked at him on the dais, not at the blade, at him. He stood up, walked to the window again, and looked at the city. The city was doing what it always did at this hour, settling into its evening rhythms, lights coming on in windows, and the sounds from the market district shifting from the daytime noise of commerce to the quieter noise of people ending their days. He had watched this city from this window many times. He had never looked at it and found anything in the looking except confirmation that everything was, for now, running as it should. Tonight it looked different. He did not know why. He went back to his desk and picked up the document he had been reading. He finished it. He signed 3 others. He worked until the 3rd night bell, which was late, later than most of the court stayed awake, and he worked with his usual efficiency and without looking at the coat hanging by the door where the paper was folded in the pocket. He only looked at it once. At the 3rd bell, when he finally set the last document aside and stood to go to bed, he crossed the room and took the coat off its hook and reached into the pocket and unfolded the paper and looked at the word again. Coward. He folded it back. He put it in the desk drawer. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a very long time, and in the morning he was not rested, and he was at his desk before the 6th bell, working, with the particular focused ferocity of a man who has decided that work is what the morning requires. The word sat in the drawer 3 feet from his left hand for the entire day. He did not open the drawer, but he knew it was there. Down in the east wing, at exactly the 7th bell, before any of the kitchen staff had come to bring her morning food, Sarah quietly opened the door to her room, checked the corridor in both directions, found it empty, and walked left toward the staircase. She was going to find the library. Whatever else was going to happen in this palace and under this king, and in the days that were now arranged ahead of her like a road she could not see the end of, she was going to start with the library. Everything else could follow in its own time. She turned right at the bottom of the staircase, following the logic of old buildings, which always put their most important rooms in the direction that required the most turns to reach. She was right on her 3rd turn. The library door was heavy wood, with iron fittings, and it was unlocked. She opened it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves, which went from floor to ceiling and covered 4 walls and held more books than she had seen in any one place in her entire life, and something in her chest that had been held quietly tight for 2 days, unknotted just slightly. She went in. She closed the door behind her. She began at the leftmost shelf and read the spines. He found the library at 11 o'clock at night. This was not something he planned. He did not go looking for her. He went to the library because he went to the library sometimes, late at night when the palace had gone quiet and the governance documents were done for the day, and his mind required something other than strategy and administration. He had a shelf in the back corner that held 18 books he had read and intended to read again, and he went there the way other men went to a familiar road. He was 3 steps inside the door when he saw the light. Not a lantern, a single candle, set on the corner of a reading table against the far wall, throwing a small, warm circle of light that barely reached the edges of the table. In the center of that circle, a person was sitting cross-legged on the library chair, with a book open in both hands, and a notebook open beside it, and the person was reading with the intensity of someone who had been doing it for hours and had not yet reached the end of what they needed. He stood in the doorway. She had not heard him. The library was thick-walled and the door was heavy, and she had not looked up from the page. He should have left. This was a simple calculation. She was in the library. She had every right to be in the library. She was not doing anything that required his attention, and the shelf he had come for was on the other side of the room, which was exactly where she was sitting, and he could come back tomorrow. He did not leave. He was not sure why he did not leave. He moved into the room carefully, which was unusual, because Calder did not generally take particular care about the sound of his own movement in spaces he owned. But something about the quality of her concentration made him reluctant to break it, the way you might hesitate to close a door loudly when the room on the other side holds something focused and rare. He reached the shelf in the back corner. He selected the book he had come for. He opened it and found the page he wanted. He read 2 pages. He looked up. She still had not moved. She was writing in the notebook now, fast and without looking at her hand. the pen moving in the particular rhythm of someone transcribing a thought that is arriving faster than the hand can fully keep up. He watched this for a moment. He sat down in the reading chair at the other end of the table. The candle was between them. The light reached him enough to read by, though barely. He read 3 more pages. She noticed him on the 4th. He heard the pen stop. He heard the small, careful sound of a person who has just registered an unexpected presence and is deciding how to respond to it. He did not look up from his book. She did not move. He turned the page. After a moment, he heard the pen resume. He finished the chapter. He closed the book and sat for a moment in the quiet. The candle had burned down perhaps 1/4 of an inch since he had arrived, which meant he had been here perhaps 40 minutes. He looked at her directly, for the first time since he had sat down. She was looking at him, not with alarm, not with the particular expression of someone working out whether they should be frightened. She was looking at him with the same steady, information-gathering attention she had used on the dais, the same look she had given him in the great hall, when he was just a problem she was in the process of understanding. He said, "You reorganized the South Archive." It was not a question. Henry had mentioned it that morning, with the tone of someone reporting an event they found difficult to categorize, the kind of thing that did not fit neatly into any existing procedure. She did not speak. She picked up her pen and wrote something in the notebook and turned it to face him across the table. The filing system by Century is inefficient for research. Subject-based retrieval is faster by a significant margin. I also found 14 documents that were misfiled entirely and are in the wrong section by about 200 years. He read this. He said, "Which documents?" She turned the notebook back, wrote, turned it again. 3 legal records from the Second King's reign that were shelved with the 4th, a collection of letters that belonged to the Border Post Archive, not the palace records, and 7 items that appear to be personal correspondence that has no business being in a public archive at all. He looked at this for a moment. "Show me," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not much, just enough for him to register it, and then she stood from the chair, closed her book, put it back precisely where she had taken it from, and walked toward the archive door at the back of the library. She paused at the door and looked back at him. He stood. He followed her. The archive was a smaller room behind the main library, lined with wooden filing cabinets and shelves of bound document cases. It smelled of old paper and cedar, which was used to discourage insects, and the cold that stone rooms hold, even in relatively mild weather. She moved through it with a confidence that said she had already learned the new arrangement thoroughly, which meant she had spent enough time in here to have not only reorganized it, but committed the result to memory. She pulled open the 3rd cabinet from the left and extracted a file. She put it on the narrow reading table in the center of the archive and opened it and pointed. He leaned over and read the document header. She was right. It was a second-era legal record that had been sitting in a 4th-era cabinet, possibly for decades. He read a little further. The document was interesting, in a way he had not expected. It was a treaty record between the first settled Pact territories and the mountain clans, a document he had believed lost. He straightened up. He looked at her. She was standing on the other side of the table, watching him read, with the expression of someone waiting to see if the other person is going to understand what they are being shown. He understood it. "The other 13, he said. She turned back to the cabinet. They spent the next hour in the archive. She moved between the shelves with the efficiency of someone who had invented the system she was navigating, extracting documents and placing them in a sequence on the reading table. And he read each one, and the ones that interested him he set to the right, and the ones that he had already known about he set to the left, and at the end of the table was a pile of 7 documents that he had not known existed, and that were, in several cases, historically significant, in ways that someone should have noticed before now. He stood at the end of the table looking at the pile. She stood across from him, waiting. "How long did this take you?" he said. She wrote, 2 days. The main library took 1. The archive took most of the second. He thought about this. She had arrived 4 days ago. She had been in the lower cells for 1 night, then the east wing. She had been in the library, he was now calculating, since very early on the 2nd morning. "What else have you found?" he said. She wrote, "A history of the tributary system from 140 years ago, that contradicts the official version in 3 significant ways, and your court poet's collected work, which is shelved incorrectly under political documents, which might explain why no one has read it in 30 years. He almost said something about the court poet but stopped himself. Instead he said, "Go back to your room." She looked at him. "It is the middle of the night," he said, which was true, and also not the full reason. She picked up her notebook. She walked past him toward the archive door. She paused in the doorway and looked back, and in the small light from the library, he could see that the expression on her face was not quite amusement, and not quite challenge, but something with elements of both. Then she left. He stood in the archive for a moment. He picked up the treaty document and brought it back to the library with him. He sat in the reading chair and read it properly, all the way through, from beginning to end. It took an hour. It was remarkable. It was a record of a negotiation that had changed the shape of the Pac territories, and it had been sitting in the wrong drawer for 60 years. He thought about the fact that she had found it in an afternoon. He went back to his chamber. He set the treaty document on his desk. He did not sleep well. The next morning was Tuesday, which was Calder's day for receiving petitions from Pac elders, and he sat in the formal receiving room for 4 hours, while representatives from 7 different territories presented their cases with the practiced language of people who had prepared for this meeting for weeks. He listened and responded, and made decisions with his usual efficiency, and the receiving ran slightly ahead of schedule, which his secretary noted in the margin of her schedule book with visible satisfaction. He did not think about the archive, or the documents, or the woman who had reorganized his filing system in 2 days. He thought about it only twice. Once, in the middle of the 3rd petition, when the elder from the eastern boundary was explaining a dispute about river water rights, and Calder's mind flicked briefly to the treaty document, and the fact that it might actually have bearing on exactly this kind of dispute, and he made a note in the margin of his petition papers. And once, just before the midday bell, when Henry came in with the day's correspondence and said, in the careful voice of a man who was choosing his words, "The woman from Ashevale has made a request." Calder did not look up from the document he was signing. "What request?" "She wants paper. She says she has filled her last notebook and requires more." He signed the document. "Give her what she needs," he said. He put down the pen and picked up the next document. Henry waited for a moment. This was his method. He waited after a statement to see if there was more coming. When there was not, he nodded and left. Calder read the next document. He read it, and he registered what it said, and he made the appropriate marginal note, and he was aware the entire time that in a room somewhere in the East Wing, a woman he could not make sense of was sitting at a desk and writing in a fresh notebook about something she found interesting, and that this was an entirely ordinary thing and not worth particular thought. He signed the document. He moved to the next one. He was running slightly ahead of his usual pace that day, which his secretary noted as well, and which she attributed, correctly, to the fact that he was working with a focused intensity that did not allow for the usual pauses. She was wrong about the reason. He was working quickly, because when he was working quickly he was not thinking about anything else. By evening, he had processed 43 documents and handled 6 administrative matters, and had a productive meeting with his northern border captain about supply routes, and he returned to his chambers with the particular tired satisfaction of a genuinely productive day. He sat at his desk. He opened the drawer. The folded paper was still there. He looked at it without picking it up. Then he took out the treaty document and set it in front of him and read it through again from the beginning, and this time he read it more slowly, making notes, and the notes multiplied until he had filled half a page of his own, and he thought that tomorrow he would go to the archive and pull the river rights documents from the past 40 years and cross-reference them against the treaty boundaries. He went to the archive. It was 2 a.m. He told himself it was efficient. She was there. Of course she was there. The candle was at a different angle, and the notebook was open to a different page, but she was in the same chair, and she was reading the same history of the tributary system she had mentioned finding 2 nights ago, and she did not hear him come in, because he came in very quietly. He should not be surprised. He told himself he was not surprised. He went to the archive. He found the river rights documents. He brought them to the table. He sat down. After a moment, She looked up. He was already reading. She looked at him for a moment with the expression that he was beginning to recognize as her primary mode of engagement with unexpected things, attentive and unfrightened, and gathering information. Then she looked back at her own book. They read in silence for 2 hours. It was not an uncomfortable silence. He was not sure when he had started to be able to tell the difference between comfortable and uncomfortable silences, because most silences had simply been silences before, background to work. But this one had a quality he noticed, a quality of two people existing in the same space without requiring anything of each other, and he found that he did not want to break it. She left first, at the third bell, standing and shelving her book and picking up her notebook with the unhurried movements of someone ending an evening, rather than escaping a situation. At the archive door she paused and wrote something on her notebook and left it on the table. Open. He read it after she was gone. The river rights boundary from 140 years ago places the eastern tributary differently than the current legal standard. The treaty document moves it 4 miles north. This might be relevant to the water dispute you heard today. He read this twice. He looked at the archive door, which was empty. He looked back at the notebook. He set it on the edge of the table, where she would find it in the morning. He sat with the river rights documents and the treaty for another hour, and by the time he left he had worked out the full shape of the discrepancy, and it was significant, and it could be resolved, and it would require sending a revised legal record to 3 different pact territories, and calling back 2 decisions he had made in the last 4 years. He would need someone to cross-reference the secondary sources. He thought about this on the walk back to his chambers. He thought about it in a way that did not acknowledge itself fully, the way thoughts sometimes go sideways around their own center. He thought, I need someone who can cross-reference secondary sources quickly and without error. He did not let himself complete the thought. He went to bed. In the morning, Henry was waiting with the day's correspondence and the schedule and the expression of a man who had noticed several things he had chosen to file quietly without comment. She's in the archive again, he said. Calder took the correspondence. I know, he said. He began to read. The first note she left outside the archive was about the court poet. She did not intend it as a commentary. It was a factual observation, placed on the table outside the library where someone would find it when the morning cleaning staff came through, folded in thirds and addressed to no one in particular. It said that the collected works of the court's official poet were misfiled in the political documents section, having apparently been placed there during the last great archive reorganization 70 years ago, and that this was interesting, because 3 of the poems referenced events in those political documents specifically, suggesting that the poet had been writing about court politics in coded form, and the filing had either preserved this intention or was a remarkable coincidence. Henry found it at 6 in the morning. He read it 3 times. He brought it to the king. Calder read it once. He said, put the works in the literary section. Keep the political documents they reference together, and mark them for cross-referencing. Henry made a note. Calder said, and tell her to put her name on the notes. Henry delivered this instruction to the East Wing at mid-morning. He found Sarah at the desk in her room, writing rapidly in the new notebook with the focused velocity of someone transcribing rather than composing, and he stood in the doorway and delivered the king's message and waited. She stopped writing. She looked at the desk in front of her. She picked up the pen and wrote at the bottom of the page and turned it for him to read. He said to put my name on them? Yes, Henry said. She looked at this for a moment, then she turned the page back and wrote something else, and turned it again. He read the note. This was not a question. It was the flat, slightly surprised notation of a person recalibrating. Yes, Henry said again. He had been the king's advisor for 7 years. He had learned to answer the question being asked, and not the question being implied. She looked at the window. She nodded once, the small decisive nod of someone arriving at a conclusion, and turned back to her writing. Henry returned to the king's study and said nothing about the exchange beyond confirmation of delivery, because he was a professional. The notes began arriving daily after that. They came at irregular intervals and on a range of subjects, always in the same very small, very neat handwriting, always signed at the bottom with a single initial, S. They arrived on the table outside the library. They arrived slipped under the door of Calder's study, which was something he did not acknowledge explicitly, but did not stop. They arrived occasionally on his actual desk when he was elsewhere, which meant she had been in his study, which was something that should have been addressed and was not. The first week's notes covered the misfiled documents and their correct placement, 3 historical discrepancies in the official Pact territory records, a proposed reorganization of the legal index that would reduce retrieval time significantly, and a short, very precise observation about the history of the tribute system that said, without any apparent agenda, that the tribute requirement had been established in a treaty, whose original text specified a maximum of 1 tribute per decade, and that the 5-year schedule currently in use postdated the original treaty by 60 years, and appeared to derive from an administrative rather than legal source. He read this last one twice. He called Henry. "Pull the original tribute treaty," he said. Henry pulled it. Calder read it. She was correct. The 5-year cycle had no formal legal foundation. He set the document down. He looked at the note, signed S in the corner. He did not do anything about it immediately, because the legal ramifications were complex, and the political implications were more complex still. But he kept the document, and he kept the note, and he put them in a specific file that he had not labeled yet, but which was beginning to accumulate a coherent shape. The second week, the notes began to address things beyond the archive. One said, the Eastgate posts would benefit from a revision of the shift schedule. The current overlap creates a 40-minute gap in coverage on the western approach between the 6th and 7th bells. Another said, the merchant records for the last quarter show a pattern in the grain purchase data that suggests someone is buying through 3 intermediaries to obscure a single large acquisition. This is not my area. I am noting it for someone whose area it is. The third, the court poet's works are extraordinary. I do not understand why no one is reading them. He answered this one, for the first time, by writing on the note itself and leaving it where she would find it in the library. He wrote, no one knew where they were. She wrote back, on the same paper, left again in the library. That is not a sufficient reason. He wrote, people are not always good about looking for things they have not been told to expect. She wrote, that the definition of the problem. He stared at this. He wrote, yes. He folded the paper and put it in the file. The third week, she left a note on his desk that said, the south window in the library has a loose fitting on the left side. In cold weather, it lets in a draft that damages the books on the shelf below. I have wedged it temporarily, but it requires proper repair. He sent the maintenance crew the next day. He did not explain how he knew about the window. She left a note that said, thank you. It is fixed. He did not respond to this one. He sat with it in his study for a while, and then put it in the file and went back to his governance documents. The weeks accumulated. The court noticed. The court was made up of people whose primary professional skill was noticing things about the king, because the king was the most important variable in all of their lives, and understanding his mood and his attention was how you stayed on the correct side of power. They noticed the notes. They noticed that the archive had been reorganized. They noticed that the king had been seen in the library at unusual hours on at least 3 occasions, confirmed by the night staff. They noticed that the tribute woman from Ashvale had been given access to the main palace records, which had not happened before, not with any tribute, not with any level of court staff below the first tier. The court began talking. They talked carefully, because they were careful people, but they talked. The conversations had the structure of hypothetical discussions, the kind where you phrase everything as a question, rather than a statement, so that you can deny having said it later. What do you think she's doing with those documents? What do you think the king's purpose is in keeping her there? Why East Wing and not the servants' quarters? The head enforcer, whose name was Grant, and who was a large man with a careful mind and a long memory, came to Henry. The tribunal woman, Grant said. He meant the tribute. Grant did not always reach for the precise word. Yes, Henry said. She's been in the restricted records section. She has, Henry agreed. The king authorized that? The king is aware of her access to the records, yes. Grant looked at Henry for a moment. Grant's expressions were economical. They communicated what needed communicating, and then stopped. This one communicated that he had noted the specific wording of Henry's answer, and the specific information it did not include. The court will have questions, Grant said. The court often does, Henry said pleasantly. Grant left. Henry went to the king. He told Calder that Grant had come to him. He told Calder what had been said and what had not been said, because Henry understood that the space between what was said and what was not said was where most actual conversations happened. Calder listened without changing his expression. "Tell Grant to direct his questions to me directly," Calder said. This was unusual. Calder did not generally receive direct questions from his court about his private conduct. He conducted his governance and his private life in separate spheres, and the court had learned to respect this boundary by the straightforward method of learning what happened when it wasn't respected. "Yes, my king," Henry said. Grant did not come directly. Grant was intelligent. He consulted with two of the senior court members instead, quietly, in the formal receiving room after a session when most of the other court members had left, and the conversation was short and had the quality of a decision being made. Calder learned about this 3 days later from his personal secretary, who had been in the corner of the room doing her own work, and who had the quality, which made her excellent at her job, of being reliably overlooked. He was not surprised. He was something else, something that sat in his chest for the rest of the afternoon, with the particular quality of information he was going to have to address before he wanted to. He went to the library at his usual time. She was there. She looked up when he came in. She noted his expression. He could see this happen, the small, careful reading of his face. He sat down. He looked at the table between them and said, "The court is asking questions about why you are here." She wrote, "What are you going to tell them?" He said, "I haven't decided." She wrote, "What are the options?" He said, "That you are a ward of the court fulfilling a research function." He paused. "That you are a guest of the palace." He paused again. "That you are under the king's personal protection." She wrote, "Which of those is true?" He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "All of them." She wrote, "Those 3 things mean different things in terms of what happens to me and what the court is entitled to ask, and what your position is relative to their questions. Which is most accurate?" He said, "You are under my personal protection." This was the first time he had said it plainly. He had not been intending to say it that way, that directly, without more context on either side of it. The sentence had come out of him like something that had been waiting just inside the door and had stepped through it before he finished deciding to open it. She looked at him. She wrote, "Why?" He said, "Because the alternative is the right, and I will not do that." She wrote, "You didn't answer the question." Why? Personal protection. You could have assigned me a formal ward status and gotten the same result without the political implication. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm aware." She looked at her notebook. She looked back at him. She wrote, "This is going to cause a great deal of trouble for you." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "Are you prepared for that?" He was quiet again. She had, he was realizing, a method of conversation that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with precision. She did not soften questions. She did not introduce them gradually or approach them through easier adjacent questions first. She asked what she meant to ask, in the plainest possible terms, with the confidence of someone who had decided long ago that clarity was worth the discomfort it sometimes caused. He said, "I've been prepared for trouble since I was 12 years old. This is a different category of it." She looked at him. She wrote, "That is either a very reassuring answer or a very concerning one. I am going to need more information before I decide which." He almost said something. He stopped. He said, instead, "What are you reading?" She turned the book to show him the spine. It was the tributary history she had found 2 weeks ago, the one that contradicted the official version. He picked it up. He read the back page of the open chapter. He set it back down. "The discrepancy in Chapter 7, he said. She looked at him with an expression of mild surprise that had an undercoat of something that might, from a certain angle, have been pleasure at a correct assessment. She wrote, "You've read it." "A long time ago," he said. "I didn't know the official version well enough then to see what it was contradicting." She wrote, "The official version was rewritten in the 43rd year of the previous king's reign. The original records are in the 3rd archive cabinet. I cross-referenced them 2 days ago." He said, "Show me." They went to the archive. The night went in, the way nights in the archive had begun to go, with the particular quality of time that happens when 2 people are working side by side on a problem they are both genuinely interested in. where the hours stop feeling like hours and become instead the distance between one discovery and the next. At some point after the second bell, she stopped and wrote something and slid it across the archive table. "He's going to ask you publicly, Grant. He'll bring it to the formal court session." Calder read this. She wrote, "I've been watching the court for 3 weeks. He's been building to it." Calder set the document he was holding on the table. He looked at the archive ceiling, which was dark oak, low, and had a particular crack in the third beam that he had been meaning to have repaired for 2 years. He said, "I know." She wrote, "What are you going to say?" He was quiet. She wrote, "I'm not asking what you're going to tell them about me. I'm asking what you actually know, that you haven't said yet. That is the real reason you stopped the right and put me in the East Wing and spend 3 nights a week in this archive." He looked at the archive door. He said, very quietly, "You know what I'm going to say." She looked at him. He said, "You've known for 2 weeks." She wrote, "I've suspected. But I need you to say it so that I know whether what I suspect is actually true or whether it's what I want to be true, and I am not yet certain which of those it is." The archive was very quiet. Outside, the palace had gone fully to sleep. The stones held their particular cold. The candle had burned down to a short stub, and the light it cast was low and warm and very still. He said, "I knew in the corridor. The first night, I walked past your cell and I could not move." He said this with the flat, factual tone he gave everything, but his hands on the table were very still. "I have been trying to find a way to understand it that does not mean what it means. I have not found one." She looked at him for a long time. She wrote, "I know what it means." She wrote, "I need some time." He said, "I know." She wrote, "Not because I'm afraid." He said, "I know that too." She looked at what she had written. She closed the notebook. She stood and picked it up and walked to the archive door and stopped, and he thought she would go, and then she turned back and looked at him with an expression that he was only just beginning to have the vocabulary for. She wrote one more thing and left it on the edge of the archive table and walked out. He read it after she was gone. But it means something different when the person choosing it has options. You had options. You are still choosing to say it. That matters to me. That is all. He sat in the archive for a long time after she left. The candle stub burned out. He sat in the dark. Tomorrow Grant would bring his questions. He had decided what he was going to say. The formal court session started at 9. Grant arrived at 8:50, which was 10 minutes early, which meant he had timed his arrival to give the impression of restrained urgency. He stood at the side of the hall with 2 other senior court members, Lord Ellsworth and Lady Pryor, both of whom had been at Varnhold for longer than Calder had been king, which gave them a particular kind of standing that they wore carefully, like a coat that is valuable and that you do not want to damage. Calder sat on the throne and watched them arrange themselves. He had been king for 11 years. He had watched courts arrange themselves before conflict many times. He understood the geometry of it, how the alliances made themselves visible in the clustering, how the people who were waiting to see which way it landed positioned themselves in the center of the room, where they could move quickly in either direction. Today the center of the room was fuller than usual. Henry stood at the foot of the throne steps with his schedule and his careful face. He did not look at Grant. He did not look at Lady Pryor or Lord Ellsworth. He looked at his schedule as if it contained information of riveting complexity. The session opened with the routine petitions, which took 40 minutes, and which Calder handled at his usual pace, making decisions and noting requirements without showing that any portion of his attention was anywhere other than the petition currently in front of him. Grant waited. He was patient. This was known about him. After the last petition, there was the usual pause where the room reshuffled itself slightly, and people shifted their weight, and the nature of the gathering changed from administrative to something with more edges. Calder sat and let it happen, and did not say anything to fill the space. Grant stepped forward. "My king," he said. He had a soldier's voice, clear and carrying. "The court has a matter of concern to raise." "Raise it," Calder said. Grant said, "The tribute from Ashvale, the woman currently residing in the East Wing." He paused to let the location register on anyone who had not already noted it. "The court wishes to understand her status." Calder said, "She is under my personal protection." Grant said. The court appreciates the clarification. He did not slow down. It is also the court's understanding that she has been given access to the restricted archive, which has historically been limited to court members of the first and second tier. That is the court's understanding, Calder said. It is accurate. Can the king explain the purpose of this access? She is better qualified than anyone in this court to use the archive effectively, Calder said. She reorganized it in 2 days. She has located 14 documents that have been missing from active use for between 30 and 90 years, including a treaty record that is currently material to a boundary dispute before this court. Restricting her access would be wasteful. The room was very quiet, in the way that a room full of people who are deciding whether to breathe gets quiet. Ellsworth said, carefully, "The court does not question the practical utility of the arrangement." He was a tall man, with white hair, who spoke slowly and with extreme precision, each word laid down like a stone. The court questions the precedent. A tributary individual in the East Wing, with archive access, under the king's personal protection. These are not standard provisions for a tribute. No, Calder said. And the deviation from the standard provisions is because I chose it, Calder said. There was another silence. Pryor spoke. She was a small woman with a quality of stillness that Calder had always found, privately, more formidable than Grant's open directness. The court understands that the king's personal choices are his own, she said. The court is simply noting that choices of this nature, in connection with a tribute individual, carry implications for the relationship between the crown and the tributary system as a whole. We would not want those implications to be unintended. They are not unintended, Calder said. Pryor looked at him. She was very good at looking at things. She said, then the court would benefit from understanding what is intended. Calder sat for a moment. In his 11 years of ruling, he had made many statements in this hall. He had made decisions that changed pact territories and altered tax structures and shifted the distribution of power in the tributary system in ways that affected thousands of people. He had done this with the steady confidence of a man who had built his certainty through work and through the specific education that comes from making decisions and living with the results. He had never been less certain of a decision than he was of this one. He had also never been more certain. He said, "She is my fated mate." The hall held this. He said it again, not louder, not softer, in the same flat level tone. "She is my fated mate. I knew it within 12 hours of her arrival. The rite was not completed because I could not complete it against a bond. The arrangements in the East Wing are because she has not yet agreed to anything, and I am not going to force that. Her archive access is because she is exceptional, and I would be an idiot not to use what she offers. The personal protection status is because without it, the law has no category for her, and I am not leaving her without one." The hall continued to hold this. In 11 years, the court had not seen Calder say something personal in a public session. They had not seen him offer an explanation that contained anything that could be called vulnerability. They processed the experience with the caution of people handling something they had not expected to touch. Grant said, after a pause that was just long enough to be meaningful, "The court notes that this is a significant development." "The court's note is received," Calder said. Pryor said, "Has the woman been informed of her status?" "Yes," Calder said. "And her response?" "Is her own business," Calder said, "and not something this court is entitled to." Another silence. Ellsworth said, with the tone of a man making the best of available information, "The law does have provisions for a royal fated bond. The council would need to convene formally to—" "I know the law," Calder said. "Schedule the council session for the end of the month. The formal declaration can wait until then. What cannot wait is the court understanding clearly that the woman from Ashvale is not to be approached with pressure or opinion, or any form of the kind of informal court communication that this room has historically used to make the king's guests uncomfortable." The room absorbed this. What the room heard in this was something they had not heard Calder say in 11 years of saying things, which was, "I am protecting something that matters to me, from you." Grant looked at Pryor. Pryor looked at Ellsworth. The look was brief and contained a complete conversation. "Of course, my king," Grant said. The session ended. The court dispersed with the particular controlled speed of people who need to talk to each other privately and are too professional to run. Henry came to stand beside the throne steps. That was clear, he said, which was Henry's way of saying, I am impressed, and also frightened for you, and also perhaps relieved. Yes, Calder said. He stood. The council session at the end of the month will be contentious. I'm aware. The law supports the bond, but the precedent of a tribute individual as a royal consort will generate significant opposition. I know. And she hasn't agreed to anything yet. Calder looked at him. Henry met the look with the expression of a man who has been doing his job honestly for 7 years and intends to continue. I know, Calder said, again, and walked off the throne steps and down the side corridor. He did not go to the east wing. He went to the archive. He was not sure what he intended when he got there. The archive was empty, and the library was empty, and the morning light was coming in through the tall library windows, in the particular way it came in on clear, cold days, flat and bright and without warmth. He went to the back corner shelf and took down one of his 18 books, which he had done many times, and he sat in the reading chair, and he did not read. He sat with the book open in his lap, and he thought about the council session at the end of the month, and the legal procedure it would require, and the opposition that Henry was right to predict. He thought about the tributary system and the original treaty she had found, and what it meant about the legal standing of the tribute obligation, and whether that standing was actually solid, or whether, examined closely, it had the kind of gaps that allow a thing to be dismantled. He thought about her. He thought about the way she had said, in writing, that she needed time, and that it was not fear. He thought about the note in the archive. It means something different when the person choosing it has options. He sat with the book unopened in his lap. She appeared in the library doorway at 11, which meant she had come from the east wing and probably knew the session had happened, either because Henry had told her or because she had developed her own intelligence network within the palace at the speed that she appeared to develop all other things. She walked to the table. She sat down. She opened her notebook. She wrote something and slid it across the table to him. How did it go? He said. They know. She wrote, I know they know. Henry told me. I'm asking how it went. Was there opposition? He said, Pryor and Ellsworth. Grant presented, but they directed. She wrote, What did you say? He said what he had said, flatly, in the same order. She listened, which with her was not a passive act but an active one, her pen tapping the edge of the notebook and her eyes on him, and her expression doing the quiet processing work that he was learning to read. When he finished, she looked at the notebook. She wrote, You told a room full of people, on the record, that I'm your fated mate. He said, Yes. She wrote, Before I agreed to anything. He said, You needed to be protected while you were deciding. I couldn't protect you without the court knowing why. She looked at this for a moment. She wrote, That is a reasonable explanation. It is also a significant act. He said, I know. She wrote, I have questions. He said, I know that too. She wrote, Not today. He looked at her. She wrote, I need to think. Today is not the day for questions. I am telling you this so that you don't interpret the thinking as a negative response. He said, All right. She looked at him. She wrote, You did something today that cost you something. I am not going to be careless with that. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. He said, Thank you. This was, he realized as he said it, the first time in a very long time that he had used those words, and meant them, in the way they were supposed to mean something, not as administrative courtesy, not as the formal acknowledgement of a service rendered, as the real thing. She looked at him with her steady eyes, and he was fairly sure she understood the distinction. She nodded once. She turned back to her book. He opened the book in his lap. They sat in the library in the morning light and read, and the sounds of the palace went about their business on the other side of the walls, and nobody came to interrupt them, possibly because word had traveled, as word does in palaces, about the nature of the morning session and what the king had said in it, and the court was in the process of deciding how to arrange itself around a reality it had not anticipated. Outside, in the city, the market bells rang at midday. Inside the library, neither of them looked up. The days after the court session were not quiet, but they were a specific kind of not quiet that was different from what had come before, the way a river changes character after it passes through rapids. calmer on the surface but moving with new intention underneath. The court rearranged itself. This was something courts did after a significant event, shifting alliances and reassessing positions, and Calder watched it happen the way he watched all political movements, with the patient attention of a man who understood that reacting too soon was usually a mistake, and that the final shape of a realignment was rarely visible in its first week. What he noticed, and what Henry confirmed with quiet efficiency, was that the opposition had split. Grant remained concerned, because Grant was a man who organized his worldview around precedent, and the idea of a tribute woman in the East Wing with a royal bond designation did not fit any existing precedent he could reference. Pryor had moved into a watchful neutrality, which Calder read as a provisional suspension of opposition, pending further information. Ellsworth had surprised everyone, including apparently himself, by saying in a small gathering that the bond was the bond, and the law was the law, and he didn't see that there was much to be done about either. There were 7 others whose positions were still in motion. Calder tracked them. He was not concerned, exactly. He had handled court opposition before. He knew how power worked in a room full of people who all wanted to stay in the room. What he was less sure about was the thing happening in the East Wing. She was thinking. She had told him she needed time to think, and he believed her, because she was precise about what she said, and did not use words carelessly. He watched the signs of this thinking in the way information reached him, the notes that arrived less frequently now, but were longer when they came, more layered, more like correspondence than observation reports. He watched it in the change of hours she kept in the library, no longer the late-night cross-referencing sessions but earlier in the day, reading that felt less like research and more like preparation. She was building toward something. He did not push. He ran the kingdom. He handled the council's procedural questions about the upcoming formal session. He dealt with the border captain's supply route concerns, which had developed into a full logistical analysis requiring 3 meetings and 2 revised proposals. He read the river rights documentation she had flagged and sent the revised legal record to the 3 affected PAC territories, which generated a week of correspondence and 1 extremely long formal complaint from the Eastern Boundary Elder, which he read, answered with precision, and moved on. He was 14 days past the court session when she knocked on the door of his study. She had not been in his study before. She had left notes. She had slipped things under the door. She had not knocked, which required her to be present and visible and acknowledged. He said, "Come in." She opened the door. She had a notebook under her arm, and her expression had the quality of someone who had prepared for a meeting and was executing the preparation. She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. He set down what he had been reading. She opened the notebook to a page that had writing on it already, which meant she had planned her questions in advance. She wrote and turned the notebook to face him. "I have been thinking for 2 weeks, and I have reached some conclusions, but I also have questions, and I would like to ask them directly, if that is acceptable." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "When you say fated mate, what does that mean to you personally? Not legally, not in terms of what the system says it means. What does it mean to you?" He thought about this. He said, "It means that I am more certain of you than I have been of anything I did not build myself. And it means that this certainty arrived without my permission, which I found inconvenient, but which I have accepted." She looked at him. She wrote, "That is an honest answer." She wrote, "Second question, what do you want from me, if I agree? Not what the law requires, or what the court expects. What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want what is already happening. You in the archive. You leaving notes that tell me things I did not know and could not find myself. You looking at my kingdom the way you look at everything, with that attention you have that does not miss anything." He paused. "I want the arguments." She looked up from the notebook. He said, "In the archive, 3 weeks ago, about the tributary system. You were not polite about it." She wrote, "You were wrong." He said, "I was. I needed someone to say so." He looked at the desk. "I have not had someone who would say so in a very long time." She wrote something and then stopped and erased it, which was the first time he had seen her erase anything. She wrote instead, "I was not sent here to agree with you." He said, "No." She wrote, "I was sent here to be used and discarded." He said, "I know." She wrote, and you are asking me to believe that you are offering something entirely different. He said, yes. She wrote, why should I believe that? He said, because if I wanted compliance, I would have chosen someone who was afraid of me. This sat on the desk between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. She wrote, the court will be hostile. He said, some of them. She wrote, I am mute and from a tributary village, and I have no title, and no family name that carries weight in this system. He said, I know. She wrote, you will spend the next 2 years managing consequences. He said, probably longer. She wrote, that doesn't concern you. He said, it concerns me less than the alternative. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back with the steady patience of a man who had decided to wait as long as necessary. She wrote, I have one condition. He said, name it. She wrote, I am not a court ornament. I am not a royal companion whose function is to be present and pleasant and quiet in the background. If I agree to this, I am telling you now that I will continue to do what I do. I will be in the archive. I will reorganize things that need reorganizing. I will leave notes. I will tell you when you are wrong. If the court objects to any of that, it is the court's problem and not mine. He said, those are not conditions. Those are things I am asking for. She looked at him. She wrote, then we understand each other. He said, we do. She closed the notebook. She looked at the desk between them, which was large and covered in papers and had, at its far left corner, a small pile of folded notes that were, he realized as she looked at them, every note she had written that he had not put in the file, but had instead kept loose on the corner of the desk. She did not mention this. She stood. She said nothing, because she never said anything. She nodded once. She walked to the door. At the door she turned back and wrote one more thing on the open page of the notebook, and left it on the side table by the door, and he read it after she was gone. I am going to need to see the council's formal procedure before the end of month session, not to be briefed on it, to read the actual legal text. He looked at this. He walked to his bookshelf and found the council procedure manual and carried it to the east wing and left it outside her door. In the morning, the manual was back outside his study, with 12 pages marked with small paper tabs and a note attached to the front that said, you have a problem with Section 4, Paragraph 9. The language about formal consent is ambiguous in a way that Ellsworth will use if he decides to stop being accommodating. I have annotated the relevant passages. He sat down at his desk and read all 12 marked pages and all the annotations. She was right about every single one. He spent the rest of the morning writing a proposed amendment to Section 4, Paragraph 9, that closed the ambiguity. He sent it to Henry. Henry sent it to the council's legal officer. The legal officer came back 3 hours later with a response that started with the words, this is significantly overdue. The court session, when it came, was 2 weeks later. In those 2 weeks, she reorganized the second archive, found 6 more historically significant documents, wrote 3 notes about the grain purchase pattern she had flagged earlier, that together constituted a fairly clear picture of a single merchant conducting large-scale price manipulation through intermediary buyers, and corrected the court's official historian on a matter of dating that the historian had gotten wrong in his published record. The historian was extremely put out about this. She was entirely unmoved by his displeasure. Henry told Calder about the historian incident with the careful tone of a man documenting events he expects to be relevant later. Calder said, was she right? Henry said, entirely. Calder said, then he has no basis for complaint. Henry noted this. She also, in those 2 weeks, began eating dinner in the small dining room adjacent to the east wing, rather than in her room alone, which was not something she announced or commented on. She simply appeared there at the usual time with her notebook and ate her meal while writing, and the kitchen staff adjusted to it without incident, because the kitchen staff were practical people who had learned that the palace's arrangements were the palace's arrangements and were not improved by commentary. Calder happened to be in the small dining room on the 3rd evening she appeared there. This was not a coincidence exactly. It was a decision he had made, and then not acknowledged to himself as a decision. They ate at the same table. She wrote, at one point, across the table, the kitchen is salting the evening soup too aggressively. He said, I'll mention it. She wrote, "Don't make it official. Just tell them." He said, "All right." She turned back to her notebook. He ate his soup, which was indeed aggressively salted. He said, "It is quite salty." She did not look up from her writing, but her hand made a small movement that was, he was fairly sure, the suppression of something. He ate the rest of the soup without comment. After dinner, she left the way she always left rooms, without ceremony, notebook under her arm. He sat at the table for a moment with his empty bowl in front of him. He felt, in the specific and somewhat alarming way of someone who has not felt a particular thing in a very long time, like he was in the correct place. This was not a comfortable feeling. It was too new to be comfortable. But it had the quality of things that are true, which is that they persist, regardless of how comfortable they are. He stood. He went back to his study. He had 3 hours of work to do, and he did it well, and efficiently, and only looked at the pile of notes in the corner of his desk once. And when he did, he looked at them with an expression that nobody in the palace had seen on Calder's face in 11 years. He did not know what to call it. He didn't need to. He turned back to the governance documents. Across the palace, in the East Wing, she was still writing. She filled 6 pages before she went to sleep, and the last entry said, "Today was a reasonable day. The soup was too salty. He is going to tell the kitchen. He will tell them too formally, and they will adjust it for 1 week, and then it will drift back. I will tell them myself next week. This is probably a metaphor for something, but I am too tired to work out what." She underlined this. She closed the notebook. She went to sleep. She found the second notebook of the court poet at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in the 4th month after her arrival, buried under a stack of outdated land survey maps in the furthest cabinet of the 3rd archive room, which was a room she had not fully catalogued because it was cold and poorly lit and smelled strongly of the cedar oil that someone had applied too generously at some point in the last century. She had gone in with an extra candle and the specific determination of someone who has a system and intends to complete it. The notebook was cloth-bound, dark green, very old. She almost set it aside with the survey maps. Then she saw the handwriting on the inside cover, the same hand as the collected works in the main library. The poet, whose name was Oliver Hart, and who had apparently been both the most officially overlooked and the most fascinating person in the palace for most of the previous king's reign. She sat down on the floor of the 3rd archive room with her back against the cabinet and her candle on the floor beside her, and she read. She read for 2 hours. The notebook was not finished poems. It was working notes, drafts, fragments, observations, and in the back pages, a personal record. Oliver Hart had been at this court for 12 years. He had watched the previous king govern. He had written about it with the precision of someone who understood that what you could say in verse was often the only thing you could say at all without consequence. She read the personal record twice. Then she sat with the notebook closed in her hands, and the candle burning low, and the cedar smell, and the cold, and she was aware that her hands were not entirely steady, which was unusual. It was not the poems. The poems were extraordinary, but she had already known they were extraordinary. It was the record in the back pages. Oliver Hart had written about a bond, not his. He had written as witness to someone else's, a brief entry from the 41st year of the previous king's reign, describing what he had observed between the king and a woman from the Southern Territories who had come to the palace as a diplomatic envoy, and had stayed 3 days and left without agreement, and the king had watched her go from the upper corridor window, and Oliver Hart had watched the king. He had written, "I have seen men lose wars with less devastation on their faces than the king had, watching a single cart drive through the south gate. The bond is a known thing. What is less known is what it costs to hold yourself inside it without completing it." I asked him once, years later, when he was very ill, and past minding what he said. He said it was like standing in a burning room, and not being allowed to reach the door. He said he learned to stop feeling it eventually. He said this in a way that made me believe he was still standing there. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about a king who had stood at a window and watched something drive away, and had spent years learning to stop feeling it. She thought about 11 years of Calder ruling a kingdom in a way that every account she had read described as cold, as calculated, as indifferent to the usual warmth of personal connection. She thought about a man who had grown up watching his father do that, who had learned, from the inside, what it looked like when someone stopped letting themselves feel. She thought about the archive sessions. She thought about the notes. She thought about his voice saying, "I want the arguments." She sat for a long time. Then she put the notebook carefully inside her own, to protect it, and picked up her candle, and walked out of the third archive room, and through the second, and through the main archive, and into the library, which was dark and empty at 5 in the morning, and then down the corridor and up the stairs. She stopped outside his study door. The light under the door was the specific quality of candlelight that meant someone was awake in there. He often worked at 5 in the morning. She had noted this. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She opened the door. He was at his desk, which was covered in the usual arrangement of papers, and he looked up with the sharp focus of a man who had been thinking hard about something, and then he saw her face, and the focus shifted. She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. She put the green notebook on the desk and wrote beneath it, "I found this in the third archive. You need to read the personal record at the back." He looked at the notebook. He looked at her face. He said, "Are you all right?" She wrote, "I'm fine." Read it. He picked up the green notebook. He found the personal record. He read. She watched him read. She had not planned to watch him, but she found she could not look somewhere else. She watched the thing that happened in his face when he reached the section about the previous king, the fine and careful change in his expression, that was the expression of a man recognizing something he has encountered before from the inside. He finished the record. He closed the notebook. He set it on the desk. He was quiet. She wrote, "The previous king knew the bond. He let it leave. He spent the rest of his reign being the person that grief made him into." Calder looked at this. She wrote, "You know about this. You watched it." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "How old were you?" He said, 12. She wrote, "And you decided." It was not a question. He said, "I decided that it would not be me." He looked at the desk. "I watched him for years after. He made good decisions. He managed the kingdom competently. He was never cruel." He paused. But there was always a room in him, with the lights off, and you could feel it from the other side of a conversation, that room, even when he was not doing anything, that should have reminded you it was there. She wrote, "And then I arrived." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "And you knew." He said, "Immediately." She wrote, "And you were furious about it." He said, "For approximately 6 hours." His voice was dry. "Then I went to the lower corridor, and I stood outside your cell, and I watched you write in your notebook for 20 minutes, and I was less furious." She looked at him. He said, "You were writing about the cat on the courtyard wall." She looked surprised. He said, "I could see the window from the corridor. I saw what you were looking at." He paused. Someone who is frightened or calculating or performing does not write about the cat. She was quiet for a moment. She wrote, "I was frightened." He said, "I know." She wrote, "I was not performing." He said, "I know that too." She wrote something and stopped. She wrote again. "The poet says your father was standing there until he died, in that burning room." Calder said, "Yes." She wrote, "You are not going to be him." He said, "No." She wrote, "I know." He looked at her. She wrote, "That is what I came to say, at 5 in the morning, which is perhaps not ideal timing. I came to say that I have been thinking for several weeks about what kind of person you are, and the archive and the notes and the sessions and the court presentation are all data, but this is different. This is the thing that I needed." He said, "What thing?" She wrote, "The reason that is not the bond. The bond is a fact. You don't choose facts, but you made choices on top of it, and I needed to understand the choices before I understood the man." He said, very quietly, "Have you?" She looked at him. She wrote, "I think so." He looked at the desk. He said, "You came at 5 in the morning." She wrote, "I was in the third archive." He said, "At 5 in the morning." She wrote, "I keep unusual hours." He said, "I've noticed." She looked at him, and the specific quality of the look had shifted. Something changed in the 2 feet between them. Not a dramatic shift, but a seismic one. The kind of change that is small in the visible sense, and enormous underneath. He said, The council session is in 3 days. She wrote, I know. I read the amended procedure. It's better now. He said, yes, because of your annotations. She wrote, you wrote the amendment. He said, with your roadmap. She looked at the green notebook. She wrote, I want to keep this. He said, it's yours. You found it. She picked it up and put it under her own notebook. She sat for a moment. She wrote, I'm going to go back to the archive. There are 4 cabinets left in the 3rd room. He said, it is 5 in the morning. She wrote, I know. The cold keeps me alert. He looked at her. Something passed between them in this look, not words, and not the kind of thing that translated into notes, something that had been accumulating through weeks of archive sessions and late-night conversations through paper, something that had the quality of arriving, as things that have been building gradually do, all at once. She stood. She picked up her notebooks. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned back. She looked at him for a long moment. She wrote one line, on the last page of her notebook, and tore it out, and left it on the edge of his desk. She went back to the archive. He picked up the page. She had written, for what it's worth, I am not afraid of the council session. He turned the page over. On the back she had written, and I am not afraid of you. He set the page down carefully. He picked up his work documents. He could not concentrate on them. He made himself anyway. 3 floors below, in the 3rd archive room, a candle was lit, and the sound of careful cataloging resumed, and the cedar smell, and the cold, and the occasional soft sound of a notebook page turning were the only things moving in that part of the palace for the next 4 hours. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the kind of enough that takes years to build, out of small, true things placed next to each other, with the patience of people who are both, in their different ways, practiced at recognizing what matters and holding on to it without making a noise about it. The 4th archive cabinet had records going back 160 years. She cataloged all of them before the morning bell. She found 3 more extraordinary documents. She left notes about all of them on the table outside the library. He found them at 7 when he came to get a book. He read all 3 notes. He stood in the library corridor for a moment. He went back to his study. He began the day. The council assembled at noon on the last Thursday of the month, in the formal chamber that sat directly behind the great hall, and was used for no other purpose. It was a smaller room than the hall, built for precision rather than ceremony, with a long table of dark wood and 14 chairs, and no decorative elements except the window at the far end, which was tall and narrow and faced east, letting in the afternoon light, at an angle that made everything it touched look slightly more significant than it was. 14 people sat at the table, Calder at the head, Henry at his right, the 12 council members arranged by seniority, Grant nearest the head on the left, Ellsworth and Pryor together in the middle, and the remaining 9 filling the rest of the table in their various postures of readiness. The council's legal officer, a compact woman named Martha who had held the position for 19 years and who was constitutionally incapable of imprecision, sat slightly apart from the table, with her documents in 3 neat stacks. The chamber door was closed. Calder said, "We are here to formalize the bond declaration under council procedure. The legal officer will walk the relevant provisions." Martha walked them. She did this with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had read these provisions more times than she had read most other things, and she did not editorialize, and she did not look at anyone in particular, which was a professional skill she had spent years perfecting. The relevant provisions took 11 minutes to cover. She covered them. When she finished, Ellsworth said, "The amended Section 4, Paragraph 9. The amendment has been submitted and accepted," Martha said. "The council received copies 2 weeks ago." Ellsworth looked at the amendment in his papers. He had read it. He had, apparently, decided what he thought about it. He said, "The amendment closes the previous ambiguity effectively." He paused. "I approved of the amendment." This was, from Ellsworth, an unusually direct statement. The room registered it. Grant said, "The formal declaration requires confirmation from the king of the nature and terms of the bond." Calder said, "Confirmed. The bond was established on the night following the tribute's arrival. It has been held without completion, pending the tribute's agreement to a formal arrangement. The tribute has agreed. The arrangement is as follows. Full royal ward status from the date of agreement, formal bond recognition under the council's procedure, and access to all palace resources and archives consistent with a royal consort's position. No tribute obligations remain outstanding. He said this without notes and without a pause. Martha made a notation. Prior said, "The council notes that the tribute individual's background is non-noble, non-territorial, and non-affiliated with any formal pack structure in the capacity of a titled position." Calder said, "The council's note is accurate." Prior said, "This raises questions under historical precedent about the formal standing of the bond recognition within the tributary system." Calder said, "It does." Prior said, "And the king's position on those questions is." Calder said, "That the tributary system, as currently constituted, has a legal foundation that is at best imprecise and at worst non-existent, and that I am in the process of revising it based on the original treaty records which have been located and authenticated in the past 3 months." He paused. "The revision is not specifically connected to this council session, but the council should be aware that it is underway, because it will affect several provisions that Prior is referencing." Prior looked at him. She said, "The original treaty records were believed lost." Calder said, "They were misfiled. They have been located." A pause. Grant said, "By the tribute woman." Calder said, "Yes." Another pause. A longer one. Ellsworth said, "I would like to read those records." Calder said, "Henry will send copies to all council members after this session." Martha continued making notations. Grant said, "The council has a procedural concern." He spoke carefully, as he always did, laying each word down with deliberate weight. "The historical precedent for royal bond recognition has, in all previous cases, involved an individual with established social standing. The concern is not personal, it is systemic. The court's legitimacy rests in part on the clarity of its hierarchy. A bond recognition that disrupts that hierarchy without a clear legal framework creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates instability. The council's responsibility is to prevent instability." Calder said, "I agree." Grant looked at him. Calder said, "Which is why the tribute obligation is being legally dissolved, not simply set aside for this one case. The revision I am developing would formally recognize that the tributary system, in its current form, creates exactly the kind of hierarchical ambiguity you are describing. It takes people from their communities, assigns them no formal status, and places them in a legal gray space. This is a structural problem." He looked at Grant. "I became aware of this problem recently. I am addressing it comprehensively." He was aware that this was not the entire answer Grant was looking for. He was also aware that it was the most accurate answer. Grant said, "The council notes the king's commitment to a structural revision. The council would ask when that revision can be expected." Calder said, "Draft proposals in 2 months. Full revision presented to the council in 4. Martha noted the timeline. Prior said, "The council's procedural concern about the immediate recognition," Calder said, "requires a formal vote under the amended Section 4. He looked at the table. "I am aware that 2 council members have not moved their stated position of opposition. I am also aware that the bond recognition requires 8 votes under the procedure, and that I currently have 9. I am telling you this not to dismiss your concerns, but because I want to be transparent about where we are." He paused. "If someone's position has changed, now is the time to say so." The room was quiet. Grant said, "My concerns are structural, as I have stated, and I believe they are being addressed in good faith." He paused. "My vote is not opposition." The room absorbed this. Prior said, "My position has been watchful neutrality. I have been watching. I am satisfied that the king is approaching this with legal rigor and not political expediency." She paused. "My vote is not opposition." Martha raised her eyes from her notations for the first time. Ellsworth said, "My vote has not been in question since the original court session." The remaining 9 voted in order, by seniority. The count was 12-0. Martha noted this. She said, "The bond recognition is formally confirmed under council procedure. The tribute status is formally dissolved. Ward status is active from today's date." Formal consort status will be activated upon the completion of the bonding ceremony at a date to be determined by the king and the recognized bond partner. She gathered her 3 stacks of documents with the efficiency of a person who has completed a task and is ready to begin the next one. Calder said, "Thank you." The council session ended. In the corridor outside the formal chamber, Grant fell into step beside Henry. Henry was carrying 4 copies of the meeting record to be signed and distributed. Grant said, "She found the original treaty records." Henry said, "She did." Grant said, "And the river rights discrepancy, and the misfiled archive, and the tributary system's legal foundation." He paused. "And the original bond records from the previous king's reign, which have not been seen since his death." Henry said, "I did not mention that." Grant said, "No, but the historian is complaining about a dating correction, and I know what documents she has been working with, and the bond records are in that section." He paused. "She knows the previous king's history." Henry said, "The king spoke to her about it." Grant was quiet for a moment. He said, "The king told her about his father." Henry said, "I believe so." Grant said nothing for several steps. He said, "The king has not spoken about his father to anyone in this palace in 11 years. Henry said, "No." They walked in silence to the end of the corridor. Grant said, "She's good." Henry said, "She's exceptional." Grant said, "I was asking the wrong question." Henry said, "People often do, at first." He distributed the meeting records. Calder went to the east wing. He knocked on the door of the 3rd room from the stairs, which had the east-facing window, and the desk and the chair by the window, and, at this point, an additional shelf that had been installed at the end of the 2nd month, because she had accumulated enough materials from the archive that the desk was insufficient. She opened the door. She had ink on her right hand, and her notebook was under her arm, and she was looking at him with the expression that meant she had been in the middle of something, and was pausing for an interruption of uncertain but probably manageable significance. He said, 12-0. She looked at him. She looked for longer than she usually looked at things. She stepped back from the door to let him in, which was the first time she had done this, and he went in, and stood in the middle of the room that had become, in 4 months, an organized and inhabited space that looked nothing like a guest room, and very much like the room of someone who lived there. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Thank you for the amended paragraph." He said, "You wrote the roadmap." She wrote, "You did the work." He said, "You always do this." She looked up. He said, "You say that the work is mine. It's not always mine, it's usually ours." She looked at the notebook. She wrote, after a moment, "I am not used to that word." He said, "I know." She wrote, "I'm going to need some time to get used to it." He said, "I know that too." She looked at him. He looked back. He said, "You should know that Grant had a question about the previous king's records." She was very still. He said, "He asked Henry. He has not asked me directly. I don't think he will." She wrote, "What is he going to do with what he knows?" He said, "Understand the situation better than he did before. Which is, in the end, what I would want him to do." She wrote, "You trust him." He said, "With my life, not with my personal history. There's a difference." She wrote, "Yes." She wrote, "I know the difference." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "The bonding ceremony. The timeline is open. You said it." She wrote, "I need to think about what I want it to look like." He said, "Take the time you need." She wrote, "I have a thought about it." He said, "Tell me." She wrote, "Not yet. I want to be sure first." He said, "All right." He turned to go. She wrote quickly, and he heard the pen and stopped. She held up the notebook. It was 12-0. He said, "Yes." She wrote, "That means, even the ones you didn't expect." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "That means something." He said, "I know." She looked at him with the full, steady attention she gave to things she was in the process of understanding completely, and for the last time, the look that meant the information had been received and processed, and was being filed in the place where the things that matter get filed. She nodded. He left. He walked back through the East Wing corridor and into the main palace, and the footsteps of his own walk sounded, to him, different than they had sounded that morning. A very small and entirely private difference that required no explanation and was not going to be given one. The palace was running, the governance was functioning, the council had voted. He had 3 days of documentation to finish before the end of the week. He went back to his study. He picked up the first document. He worked. She planned the ceremony herself. This was not something that had been done before. Varnhold's bonding ceremonies had a traditional structure, one that Henry knew precisely and that the palace's ceremonial officer could produce from memory with his eyes shut. It involved the great hall and formal dress and witnesses and a spoken declaration and the exchange of a formal recognition symbol that was, technically, different from a ring, but had the same general function and was treated with the same gravity. Sarah read the ceremonial procedure from beginning to end. She read it 3 times. She wrote a note and left it on Calder's desk. The traditional ceremony assumes a number of things about the participants that don't apply here. I have some thoughts. Can we discuss them before anything is scheduled? He came to the East Wing that evening. They sat on opposite sides of her desk, which was covered in the usual material of her days, an open archive document, 2 notebooks, a reference map of the original Pact territories that she had found in the second archive, and which had been very useful for the tributary revision project. She had moved the notebooks to the floor to make space, and now the archive document and the map shared the desk between them. She opened the current notebook and laid it flat. She wrote, "The ceremony says the bond partner offers a spoken declaration accepting the bond." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "I don't speak." He said, "I know." She wrote, "So either the declaration is spoken by a representative, which is the traditional alternative in some circumstances, or it is given in another form." He said, "What form do you have in mind?" She wrote, "Written, formal, on record, in front of the court." He said, "That's acceptable under the amended procedure. Martha confirmed it this morning." She looked at him. He said, "I asked her, in case you wanted it." She wrote, "You already asked." He said, "I thought it might come up." She wrote, "When did you ask her?" He said, "The day after the council session." She looked at the notebook for a moment. She wrote, "That's 2 weeks ago." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "You were thinking ahead." He said, "I usually am." She wrote, "I know. It's one of the things about you that I found initially irritating and have since revised my opinion of." He said, "What changed your opinion?" She wrote, "I realized it was the same thing I do, and I couldn't be irritated about my own habit." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What else is in the ceremony plan?" She turned a page and showed him what she had been working on. She had been thorough. The ceremony plan covered the location, which she had changed from the Great Hall to the smaller formal room where the council had met, with a note that said, "The Great Hall is for performance. The formal chamber is for things that are true. The witnesses and the document record and the written declaration would be in the chamber." She had designed a document format for the declaration that would be archived immediately as part of the formal record. She had changed the traditional time of day from mid-morning to late afternoon, with a note that said only, "Better light." She had kept everything else simple. No elaborate dress requirements, no ceremonial procession, no formal banquet following, though she had noted that if the kitchen wanted to prepare something for the court afterward, that was their decision and not hers. He read through the plan. He said, "The location." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "The council chamber is a good choice." She wrote, "I thought you might prefer the hall." He said, "Why?" She wrote, "It's where you usually make formal statements. It has the weight of precedent." He said, "I've spent 11 years making formal statements in the hall for the court's benefit. This is not for the court's benefit." He looked at the plan. "The chamber is right." She wrote, "The late afternoon." He said, "Also right." She wrote, "I have one more change from the traditional procedure." He said, "Tell me." She wrote, "The traditional procedure has the presiding officer ask both parties to confirm. I don't want a presiding officer asking me to confirm. I want to go first." I want to write the declaration in advance and have it in the chamber before the ceremony starts, so that when you arrive it is already there. The confirmation is already given. You walk in and it's done." He was still. He said, very carefully, "Walk me through the reason." She wrote, "In the traditional ceremony, the presiding officer asks, and the bond partner answers. The structure is a question and a response. The question comes from outside you. The response is what you give when asked. I don't want to respond to a question about this. I want to make a statement. My own, unprompted, without being asked, because I chose it and not because someone asked me to confirm it." He read this twice. He said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." She wrote, "Since the archive. Since the night with Oliver Hart's notebook." He said, "What changed?" She wrote, "I understood, that night, what it would mean to choose it, and what it would mean not to. I understood what the difference looked like, on the inside. I'd been trying to understand it from the outside, and the outside wasn't giving me enough information." He said, "And now?" She wrote, "Now I understand it from the inside." He looked at her across the desk. She looked back. He said, "The declaration in the chamber before I arrive." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "So the first thing I see when I walk in is the document." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "And you'll be there already." She wrote, "I'll be standing at the table." He said, "Not at the far end. Not arranged for effect." She wrote, "At the table." He said, "All right." She wrote, "You can change any of it." He said, "I'm not changing any of it." She looked at him. He said, "When?" She wrote, 2 weeks. "I want to write the declaration properly. It takes more than 2 drafts." He said, "I know." She wrote, "You don't know. You've never read anything I've written in draft." He said, "I know that you don't write anything carelessly. 2 weeks is not unreasonable." She looked at the plan on the desk. She wrote, "I also need a new notebook." He said, "I'll have Henry bring 3. She wrote, "1 is enough." He said, "Have 3. She looked at him. He said, "You fill them quickly." She wrote, "I don't need to be managed." He said, "I know. Have 3 notebooks." There was a pause. She wrote, at the bottom of the page, "Fine." He stood. She stood. He said, "Good night." She wrote, "Good night." He walked to the door. He paused. He said, "The declaration. I won't read it before the ceremony." She looked up. He said, "It should be what you want it to be, not what you think I am expecting." She wrote, "I know." He said, "I'm telling you anyway." She wrote, "I know that too." He left. She sat at the desk for a long time after he was gone, in the way she sometimes sat after an exchange that had given her more than she could process immediately, not doing anything but existing in the space of it, the way you stand outside after rain to feel the air. She picked up a pencil. She opened the oldest of the 3 notebooks, the nearly full one, to a blank page near the back. She wrote for 1 hour. At the end of the hour she had 6 pages that were the wrong draft. She looked at them. She turned past them to the next blank page. She started again. This draft was better. It was still not right. She kept the second draft, and set both notebooks aside, and went to sleep. In the morning, she was in the archive before the 6th bell. She catalogued the last remaining cabinet in the 3rd archive room, which contained nothing extraordinary, except a collection of correspondence from a border captain from 80 years ago, that was remarkable for being, in Sarah's assessment, the most exasperated official correspondence in the historical record. Every single letter written with the barely contained frustration of a man who had been repeatedly promised supplies and repeatedly received the wrong ones, until the final letter, which was simply a list of what had been requested and what had arrived, laid out in 2 columns, with no commentary, which she found more eloquent than any of the letters before it. She noted this. She also finished the preliminary draft of the tributary revision framework, which she had been developing alongside her archive work for 6 weeks, and which had grown from a research project into a full structural proposal covering the legal dissolution of the tribute obligation, the recognition of tributary PAC autonomy under the original treaty framework, and a proposed alternative cooperative structure that would give the PACs formal representation in the Council, without requiring the current hierarchical submission. It was 43 pages. She read it through twice, made corrections, and left it on Calder's desk. It was the largest document she had produced. She had signed it, for the first time, with her full name, Sarah, of Ashvale. He came to the East Wing at midday. He said, "This is the full proposal." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "It's 43 pages." She wrote, "The preliminary draft is 43 pages. The final will probably be longer." He said, "I've read the first 15. It's correct." She wrote, "I know." He said, "You signed your full name." She wrote, "It is a formal document." He said, "You've never signed anything with your full name before." She looked at the notebook. She wrote, "I know." He sat down across from her. He said, "Sarah of Ashvale." She looked at him. He said, "It is a good name." She wrote, "It is the name I have." He said, "Yes." She wrote, "In 2 weeks it will be a different name." He was quiet. She wrote, "I've been thinking about that." He said, "What have you decided?" She wrote, "I want to keep both. Sarah of Ashvale, of Varnhold, the place I came from, and the place I am." He said, "That is a legal option. Martha can include it in the registration." She wrote, "I know. I read the procedure." He said, "Of course you did." She wrote, "I read everything." He said, "I know." She looked at him with the look she gave to things that she had decided were true, the final settling look, the look that filed something permanently. She wrote, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks. She turned back to her work. He went back to his. The 2 weeks were the same as the weeks that had come before them, except that they were not the same at all, and both of them knew this in the private, unspoken way that people know things that are going to change their lives, carrying the knowledge beside the ordinary days as they go, not letting it interrupt the archive work and the governance documents and the evening meals and the occasional late-night library sessions, but aware of it, in the way you are aware of something that is waiting just at the edge of the visible. On the evening before the ceremony, she went to the library. She wrote the final draft of the declaration. She finished it at midnight. She read it through once. She did not change anything. She folded it and put it in the front cover of the new notebook and went to her room and slept. In the morning, before anyone else was awake, she walked to the council chamber and placed the folded page on the table. She stood in the empty chamber for a moment. She looked at the page. She looked at the east-facing window and the early light that was just beginning to come through it. She went back to the east wing to get ready. The ceremony was at 3 in the afternoon. The light came through the east-facing window of the council chamber at 3 in the afternoon, in a long, warm, unbroken line that crossed the table and touched the far wall, which was something she had observed when she first chose the room, and which had proved, on the actual day, to be even more exactly right than she had expected. She stood at the table. The folded page was where she had left it that morning, in the center of the table's surface, plain white paper with no seal and no ceremony around it. The witnesses were arranged along the walls. Henry, who had been preparing this room since 11 in the morning, with the anxious thoroughness of a man who had decided that every detail being correct was the one thing within his control. Martha, who stood with her 3 document stacks and her notation pen and an expression of professional readiness. Grant, who stood at the left wall with his hands behind his back and the expression of a man who had arrived at a new position through honest reconsideration and was settled in it. Pryor and Ellsworth side by side, and the remaining 9 council members in a loose, respectful arrangement. They were not the full court. She had specified the witnesses in the ceremony plan. The council, Henry, Martha, and no others. No audience. No performance. She stood in the winter gray wool she had worn on her second day in the palace, the same dress she had been wearing in the library the first night Calder came in, which she had chosen deliberately, and which Henry had initially offered to replace 3 times, and then stopped offering. The chamber was quiet. Then the door opened. Calder came in. He saw the page on the table first, which was what she had intended, and he stopped. He was still in the doorway. He looked at the page with the same expression he had when he first read the archive documents she had flagged for him, the expression of someone encountering a thing they had been waiting for, and not letting themselves expect. Then he looked at her. She looked back. He walked to the table. He stood across from her. He picked up the page. He read it. She watched him read. The page was not long. She had written it 6 times, and the final version was the shortest, which was how it usually went. The first drafts were too much, and the last one was what was actually true. It said, in the small, neat handwriting that had filled 47 pages of archive notes and 3 notebooks of personal record, I am choosing this because I want it, not because I was sent here, and not because I have no other options, and not because the bond is a fact that has weight regardless of consent. I am choosing it because I have spent 5 months in this palace, watching you do the work of governance with integrity, and the work of human connection, with the same careful effort that does not come easily to either of us. And because you asked me to stay, and then asked me what I wanted, and then waited, which is a sequence of events that I have not previously encountered, and which I found significant. I am choosing it because the archive is better when someone knows what they're looking for, and because you read the court poet, and because you told me I was wrong about the river boundary and you needed someone to say so, and because all of these things are true at once, and the truth of them together is different from the truth of any one of them separately. The word for what they add up to is the word I am using by signing this document, and so yes, by choice, with information, without condition except the one I already named, which you have already accepted. Sarah, of Ashvale and Varnhold. He read to the end. He was still. Henry was making the precise movements of a person who was trying very hard not to do anything that required him to look at his own face. Grant was looking at the window. Martha was making notations with the focus of someone who has decided that the document is what she is here for, and the document is what she is attending to. Calder set the page down. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at her. He said, "You read the court poet." She picked up the pen from the table and wrote in the margin of the document, which was not traditional. "I told you the works were extraordinary. I expect you to have read them before the end of the month." He looked at the margin note. Something happened in his face. She had been reading his face for 5 months, and she had a working vocabulary for it now. A personal dictionary of the small changes that said the things he did not say out loud. This one she had no word for. It was new. It was the expression of someone who has been handed something they had stopped letting themselves want, and who is in the process of determining that it is real. She had worn that expression herself, once, in the 3rd archive room, reading Oliver Hart's personal record. Martha said, from her position at the wall, "The declaration has been signed and witnessed by the council members present. The king's formal confirmation is," Calder said, "confirmed." His voice was the same as it always was, flat and level. Except that it was not, and everyone in the room heard the thing that was not the same, and heard what it meant, and none of them said anything. Martha noted this. "The formal recognition is complete, as of the 3rd hour of this date," she said. "Documents will be registered with the legal record by the end of business today." She gathered her 3 stacks. Henry let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since before the ceremony started. Grant uncrossed his arms. Pryor looked at Ellsworth. Ellsworth looked back. The look was brief and contained, among other things, something that was recognizably satisfaction. Calder said, "Thank you all." The witnesses began to move, the careful, respectful movement of people, leaving a room where something important has happened, and giving it the proper space. Henry was last. He paused at the door. He looked at Calder, and then at Sarah, and then at Calder again, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been doing a job carefully and honestly for a long time, and has just seen it produce the right result. He said nothing. He left. The chamber door closed. They were alone. The light was still coming through the east window. Still the same warm angle, though the sun had moved slightly, and the line across the table had shifted by a few degrees. The folded page was still on the table between them, with her margin note in the corner. She looked at the margin note. She wrote, in the new notebook she had in her hands, "I know that was not standard procedure." The margin note. He said, "No." She wrote, "Is it in the legal record?" He said, "It's in the signed document, which is part of the legal record, which means it is now officially the only margin note in Varnhold's bonding history." She looked at him. She wrote, "Good. He looked at her. He said, "You are not what I expected." She wrote, "You had expectations?" He said, "Not about you specifically, about what this would feel like." She wrote, "What did you expect it to feel like?" He said, "Today?" She wrote, "It won't take long. I know where everything is." He said, "Sarah." She looked up. He said, "The archive will be there tomorrow." She wrote, "I know. I just—" She stopped. She wrote, "It is a lot. The ceremony. I work when there is a lot." He said, "I know." He sat down. He said, "I'll come to the archive tonight." She looked at him. He said, "At the usual time." She wrote, "You don't have to." He said, "I know." He looked at the table. "I want to read the preliminary tributary revision proposal properly. I read the first 15 pages yesterday. I'd like to read the rest." She wrote, "It's 43 pages." He said, "I'm aware." She wrote, "It will take most of the night." He said, "I read quickly." She looked at him, with the full, steady attention she gave to things that were true, and that she had decided to keep. The look that said, "Received, processed, filed." She wrote, "All right." She stood. She picked up the signed page from the table, carefully, and put it in the front cover of the new notebook beside the last draft she had written. The final version, the one that was now also the legal document. She went to the door. She stopped. She turned back. She looked at him sitting at the council table in the afternoon light, in the room she had chosen because it was for things that were true, with the small margin note on the table in front of him. She wrote, quickly, and held up the notebook for him to read across the room. "The court poet. End of the month. I will ask you about them." He said, "I'll read them." She wrote, "You'd better." She lowered the notebook. She left. He sat at the table for a while. He picked up the signed page and read the margin note again. He set it down. He looked at the window, which was dimming now as the afternoon moved toward evening, the light going from gold to the cooler tone of a winter sky, settling into dusk. He had governed this kingdom for 11 years, with the particular kind of care that comes from deciding that care is what you owe a thing, regardless of what you receive in return. He had done it well. He had done it alone. He had stood in rooms very much like this one, and made decisions, and understood that the decisions were his to make, and his to carry. He sat in the quiet for a moment. He thought about 43 pages that needed reading. He thought about the court poet, whom he had honestly not read thoroughly, and was now apparently obligated to read by the end of the month, or face an informed question he could not deflect. He thought about the archive, and the late-night sessions, and the candle stubs, and the notes, and the margin note in the corner of the document that was now the official legal record of a decision that had arrived in his life the way all true things arrive, without asking permission, and without apology, and then stayed. He stood. He went back to his study. He had 3 hours of work before the evening. He did it well, and without pausing, and with the particular concentrated efficiency of a man whose mind was fully engaged with the task in front of him, and not carrying weight in an unused room somewhere further back. The room that had had its lights off for 11 years was lit. He did not need to name this. He knew it. In the archive, 3 floors below, the 4th section of the secondary archive was being catalogued with the unhurried speed of someone who knows what they are doing and does not need to prove it, and the notebook that accompanied this work was open beside the reference materials, and the entries were already filling the fresh pages with the same voice that had filled the previous 3 notebooks, and the 2014 pages before that, factual and precise, and with the occasional notation that was not factual but true, which was a different category and the more important one. The entry for today was short, and it is done, and I chose it, and these are the same sentence from different angles. The court poet. Extraordinary, he will agree. I am going to make sure he has read the 3rd collection before I ask him about it, because the 3rd collection is the one that matters, and I want him to have met it properly before we talk. She underlined this. She closed the notebook. She turned back to the archive. The catalog was almost done. She had been working on it since the 2nd day after her arrival, and it was nearly complete. And when it was complete, it would be the most organized and cross-referenced archive record this palace had ever held, which she knew because she had read the previous version, which was the work of a palace archivist from 80 years ago who had been competent and thorough and had the mild disadvantage of not being her. She worked until the 9th bell. Calder arrived at 10 past, which was his usual time, carrying the tributary revision proposal and a candle that he set on the corner of the archive table, and then sat down and opened the document to page 16. She looked up when he came in. He looked at her. She turned back to the cabinet. He turned to the document. The archive was quiet and cedar-smelling and cold, and 2 candles made a reasonable light, and the night went in the way that nights with 2 people doing work they both understand tend to go, without drama and without punctuation, one thing placed after another in the way that things are placed when the people doing the placing have stopped needing to explain themselves and can simply be in the space together and work. At some point past midnight, she finished the last cabinet. She stood. She stretched. She wrote in the notebook. "It's done." He looked up. She wrote, "The full archive. Every section. All 4. He said, "How long did it take?" She wrote, 5 months. He said, "All together?" She wrote, "In terms of actual hours, probably 300. He said, 300 hours. She wrote, "The 3rd section was very disorganized." He looked at the archive around him, at the neat labels on the cabinet drawers, at the cross-reference index she had built on the table at the back, at the 4 rooms of organized, retrievable, properly dated, correctly filed records that represented 5 months of the kind of patient, careful, unglamorous work that produced results that would last for decades. He said, "Sarah." She looked at him. He said, "This is extraordinary work." She wrote, "I know, I'm very good at it." He looked at her. She wrote, "You can tell me it's extraordinary. I accept compliments. I just also happen to know it's true." He said, "All right." He said it with something in his voice that was almost warm, and was, she now recognized, the thing that Calder had, instead of the loudly expressed warmth that some people offered freely. A quiet, certain thing that didn't need to announce itself because it was already there. She sat down across from him. She said nothing, because she never said anything. She picked up her notebook. She wrote for a while. He read for a while. The candles burned. The archive held them. Outside, Varnhold slept, the 1,000 sleeping sounds of a city that had been here a long time and intended to keep being here. And inside the palace, the governance documents waited on the desks where they had been set, and the council chamber held the afternoon's legal record in the document register, and the East Wing room had a coat on the hook and 3 notebooks on the desk, and a map of the original Pack territories pinned to the wall beside the window. It was late. It was the kind of late that does not feel late when you are in the middle of it. She finished what she was writing. She looked at it. She wrote one more line at the bottom of the page, a note that was not for anyone. The kind of note you write not to be read, but to say the true thing into the record, because the record matters, and because true things deserve to be written down. She wrote, "I was sent here to disappear. I did not disappear." She looked at it. She added, "I did not want to disappear." She closed the notebook. She set it on the table. Outside, the night was very quiet. She reached for the next case in the document stack and found that she had already catalogued them all, and there was nothing left to do, and this was a feeling she was not entirely sure what to do with, the feeling of a completed thing. She sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up the archive index, which was her own document, the thing she had built to make the archive navigable, and she opened it to the introduction page, and she read what she had written there, which was, "This index covers the complete palace archive, as reorganized and verified from the date of this record. All documents are cross-referenced by date, subject, and territory. Gaps in the record are noted and dated. The intention is that anyone who knows what they need can find it, and anyone who does not know what they need can discover it." She read the last sentence again. Anyone who does not know what they need can discover it. She had written that about the archive. She understood. Sitting in the cedar-smelling cold of the archive room at midnight with a completed catalog and a signed document in her notebook, and a man reading governance proposals across the table, that she had also written it about herself. She set the index down. She looked at the candle. She looked at the window. which showed nothing but the black of a winter night. She picked up her notebook and her pen, and she turned to the first blank page of the new section, the clean white space that was the beginning of whatever came next, and she started to write.